So, Bessie has a new box to sit in. She looks so happy about it. Oh, now she needs to come out. She knows when I start talking to no one that it must mean I'm talking to her. Anyway, I couldn't pass up the chance to show you Bessie being cute. But anyway, Sean the Book Maniac, a couple weeks ago now, created his Grab 10 Books and Talk About Them tag, or anti-tag. And Steve Donahue did it, and Sean actually tagged Steve and also tagged me, and then Steve decided to do the tag again without being tagged, and reworked it into the Grab-and-Gab tag, which in his iteration was where you grab 5 books now, just to keep it manageable, and gab about them, or just talk about them. Sean the Book Maniac, when he went to do a Grab-and-Gab, took issue with the arbitrary limit of 5 books, but for me that works quite well, because unlike Steve and Sean, I don't have 5,000 books I can talk about here. So, 5 worked well for me, but I'm just gonna get right to them. So, the first book I want to talk about is one I haven't presented on this channel before. It is Misbehaving, The Making of Behavioral Economics by Robert H. Thaler. Behavioral economics, is the application of psychology to the field of economics. The field of economics, as I understand it, as I learned about it in high school, so it was a long time ago, so don't take my word for this, but, or don't quote me, but, it took as a premise that people act rationally, and that they will do things that act to their benefit, and will not do things that will, be to their detriment. But in psychology, often we find that people do things that aren't in their best interests. And so behavioral economics kind of takes that premise and runs with it. So it's kind of about how people, about economic behavior that isn't rational, and just more generally the application of psychology to economics. And this book will be particularly interesting, I think, because Robert Thaler won the Nobel Prize this year, Nobel Prize for Economics, not the Nobel Prize that you would expect a booktuber to be talking about, but, and he is also the former student of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who are two very, very famous psychologists, who also, I think, jointly won the Nobel Prize in economics many years ago, and whose work I'm familiar with because they came up with this idea of heuristics. And heuristics are sort of cognitive shortcuts that people use when processing information. So an example of a heuristic would be the simulation heuristic, where a person will figure out how they expect another person to act by imagining themselves in the same situation. So you can see how that means that they can just use their own experiences and their own perceptions to figure out how another person might act. And on the whole, that will usually work well, but sometimes it's inaccurate because people are different from each other. And then there are many other heuristics. That's just one major example. So I think that'll be very interesting, because behavioral economics is something I've always wanted to learn more about, but just haven't buckled down and bought a book about it and read it. So yeah, I think this will be a great read. The next one is one that I just recently read, and that I'm mentioning because I don't think I'm going to get a chance to do any kind of an October wrap-up or Friday reads where I can talk about it, and it is Shakespeare by Anthony Burgess. So this is a short biography of Shakespeare, kind of a speculative biography. And Burgess very often will go out on a limb and sort of almost fantasize based on what facts are known about Shakespeare's life and times. You know, he comes up with this whole story about how Shakespeare ended up meeting and marrying the woman that he did marry, based largely on the fact that she gave birth to their first child only 6 months after they got married, suggesting that there was some premarital shenanigans. But, you know, he will indicate that, and he will indicate when he's going off on a limb. And it's so fun to kind of see him, you know, develop these stories just based on what he does know. And it's so well written that, honestly, I was fine with the fact that some of it might not be true. And I also loved he would often, when he was talking about the plays of Shakespeare, would just briefly comment on the plays, and I tended to really love those. Maybe they're not the most cogent literary criticism, but I enjoyed them anyway. So yeah, I found this a good introduction to Shakespeare's life. I'd like to read after having read this, I'd like to read a kind of bigger biography of him. Although, as I said in the video where I originally hauled this, I haven't had much luck with biography, but maybe with some an introductory text kind of under my belt, maybe biography of Shakespeare will be easier to digest. I don't know. So yeah. That's my second one. Third one is one that actually came up today indirectly for me in one of my classes, and it's the Essays and Aphorisms of Arthur Schopenhauer. This is a Penguin Classics edition that's taken from his last book, which has a weird Latin-sounding name, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, but so this is just a collection of short, usually very short essays, and then aphorisms in the back, which are just very brief little, usually a paragraph or like a few sentences long things. And it came up today because in class I ended up talking about the hedonic treadmill. And the hedonic treadmill is this idea that's important to psychology, and that Schopenhauer, I don't know if he was the first one to develop the idea, but it was very important to his philosophy. And it's this idea that we humans, we tend to, each of us have some big goal in mind, some prize that we covet, and to strive for it with all our might, and to feel as though that one thing will make us happy once we get it. You know, we predict that it will lead to lasting happiness, and then we get to it, we achieve it, whatever it is. You know, we get the degree, or we get we marry the person we love, or whatever, and it's kind of an anticlimax. It just, you know, you're on a cloud for maybe a day or two, and then kind of you just return to baseline. And then basically you're left feeling kind of empty, and all you're left to do is to just set some other goal or look for some other prize to strive for. And so then you've just started all over again. And for Arthur Schopenhauer, the great tragedy of human life is that we continue on this hedonic treadmill for our entire lives, and the only thing we get in return is to die and never come back. And that had a huge influence on me when I was in college. I really became a nihilist when I was in college. I think I was a budding nihilist in high school, but I didn't know what nihilism was. But yeah, that aspect of his philosophy in particular had a big impact on me, and I still think about it very often. And I was thinking about it today, so that's why I'm talking about it here. The last two are things I want to read a few things from. The first is one that I just happened to open to the other day, and it's The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Essays by Albert Camus. And The Myth of Sisyphus is his long-ish, I mean it's not that long, essay, which is basically one of the foundational texts of existentialism, in which he identifies the idea of the absurd, capital A, absurd, which is this idea that we humans, we want to have meaning in the world. We want to believe that there's meaning in the world, but the world is inherently meaningless. So that's the absurd, is the tension between our desire for meaning and the inherent meaninglessness of the universe. And so he kind of goes from there. But I just read a few quotes from here, and I was adding to my commonplace book the other day, and I just wanted to read a few to you. One from The Myth of Sisyphus in particular, which is this: "Taut faces, threatened fraternity, such strong and chaste friendship among men, these are the true riches, because they are transitory." That's just not terribly relevant to his main thesis. I just thought that was a beautiful thought, that human relationships are in part beautiful, not only in spite of, but because of the fact that they are transitory, and the fact that you'll never be able to know the people you know ever again. So yeah, that's the first one. And then I wanted to give a plug for some of the essays in here that aren't The Myth of Sisyphus. There's one essay in particular called Summer in Algiers, which I liked a lot. And in Summer in Algiers, he is writing, it's sort of a journalistic piece about his spending a summer in Algeria, the capital of Algeria. And he's writing about his feeling how he feels among the environment there and among the people. And he does present kind of an essentialized view of these people who he seems to view as kind of primitive, but like that criticism isn't relevant to his philosophical point. So I'm just going to read you this one quote from it. It is a pretty long quote, so be prepared. Here it goes. Unity is expressed here in terms of sun and sea. The heart is sensitive to it through a certain savor of flesh, which constitutes its bitterness and its grandeur. I learned that there is no superhuman happiness, no eternity outside the sweep of days. These paltry and essential belongings, these relative truths, are the only ones to stir me. As for the others, the ideal truths, I have not enough soul to understand them. Not that one must be an animal, but I find no meaning in the happiness of angels. I know simply that this sky will last longer than I. So yeah, I think the Summer Analogies is a beautiful essay, if only for that one quote. And then the last essay, or no, not the last essay, but another essay in here called The Minotaur. And just the first couple sentences, I think, are very relevant particularly to the 21st century. There are no more deserts. There are no more islands. Yet there is a need for them. In order to understand the world, one has to turn away from it on occasion. In order to serve men better, one has to hold them at a distance for a time. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that speaks to 21st century and how we're constantly surrounded by sort of distractions, and it is important to get away for a while and be in a quiet spot. Yeah. And then the last book I have here is The Poetry of Jaroslav Seifert. You can see I tagged many poems here. So Jaroslav Seifert is the only Czech writer ever to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. There have been a couple other Czech writers who've been considered contenders. There was Karl Čapek, who was a playwright and novelist who coined the term robot, actually. And I know that Milan Kundera, also a Czech novelist, is sometimes thrown around when it comes to the season of when the Nobel Prize is announced. His name is sometimes thrown around as a possible contender. But Jaroslav Seifert was a poet. He died only about a year after he won the Nobel Prize. He was actually in ailing health when he won it, and he actually couldn't attend the awards ceremony. I think his daughter went and gave his acceptance speech for him. But his poems are very kind of influenced by existentialism, I think. Very much life affirming. Very much about the transience of the world, and kind of trying to find the affirmation in that and the meaning in that, I suppose, even though technically an existentialist wouldn't try to find meaning. But I mean, Jaroslav Seifert doesn't have to be a perfect existentialist. I'm not saying he is an existentialist, just I see a lot of existential influences in his poems. And I have one poem marked off that I thought I would read. It is called Funeral Under My Window. I complain to the wind. Our life's but a minute. Horses, turn back. If only horses could turn back. Turn back our time, once more to begin it. If only the clock striking backwards could bring us the moments we wasted, frittering. If only the machine, running in reverse, could unravel the noose of the suicide. If only the moon which set yesterday returned once more to the sky today. If only we knew how to weep again over our trivial sorrows. I complain to the wind. Hear its howl and its din. If only the wind could turn back the mask of dead skin. The mask which at the point of death flew off the face with its last breath, and which the wind now sweeps and batters. To let us kiss it once again before it's borne away and shatters in the tops of trees, in the tops of rain. Yeah, that's just beautiful to me. Beautiful poem about, wishing you could reverse time, which I think everyone feels at some point. But anyway, so those are my 5 books. Right now, my clock is saying that this has gone on for 16 minutes, but I have some editing to do, so I'm hoping it's not that long. But yeah, anyway, thank you for watching, guys. Bye.